Absolute treat this morning here on Divinal Countdown, catching up with none other than Craig Dugald McLachlan, talking all things wonderful music. We are talking gold Logies, we are talking television, we are talking the whole lot. Welcome to Divinal Countdown, Craig. How are you?
Scotty, it's great to be here. I can't believe you managed to slip the Dougal in. My family will be beside themselves.
I thought it was the best place to start. Look, where do we start with 30 years, film, television, music, musical theatre, so many different things? Where's the best place to start, Craig?
That's a good question. I guess the best place to start, and seeing as we are going to be talking about music for a fair bit of the time this morning, I was reminded just the other day by a friend of mine who happened to be at my first public performance as a young guitar player at the age of 11 at what used to be, Scott, the Entrance Catholic Community Hall on the main street in a town called the Entrance for anyone who knows the Central Coast region of New South Wales. Mm-hmm. I think the Aboriginal word for the place was karagi, which meant the opening to a big lake. So the entrance is on this peninsula with the ocean on the eastern side, a wonderful big lake to the west, and the Catholic hall there. At the age of 11, I was a rhythm guitarist playing a Burns of London solid body electric guitar for the local dance band, playing a function, and that was lighting the fuse for me in terms of communing with an audience and knowing what it was I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
How did you get there? Music in your house at the beginning? Was music in and around the home? Was there a lot of music being played? How did you go about learning the guitar and so on?
Yes, there was a lot of music in the house, and it was a musical bag of licorice, all sorts. You had my dear late dad, Peter, who was mad for... Look, with a name like McLachlan, and if you throw Dougal into the mix, clearly with Scottish lineage, the bagpipes were never going to be far away from the stereo system. I grew up listening to everything from military tattoo type stuff to Andy Stewart, Donald Where's Your Trousers. To balance that, my brother Bruce, who's 8.5, almost 9 years older than me, had this fantastic vinyl collection, Scott. He had all the stuff there from the Beatles and Stones, obviously, but Cream, Grand Funk Railroad, all of Hendrix, of course. All of this fantastic stuff. So when he wasn't home, I went into the area that should have been out of bounds to the younger brother, which was his bedroom. And he had a little portable stereo, a little portable record player back in the day. And I'd drop the needle on Hendrix and hear these sounds. Scott, I remember seeing the cover of an album, and our true vinyl enthusiasts might remember this one. The band was Golden Earring, and they had an album called Moontan. Very controversial artwork on their cover at the time was kind of a naked gal. Do you remember the cover?
Yeah, there's a fold out as well.
That's right, right. Big radio hit around the world at the time, of course, was Radar Love. Doom ba doom doom ba doom doom ba doom. I've been driving on that man's wet on the wheel. Da, 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 da. But there was a track on there, Scott, from memory. I think it was Candy's Gone Bad, and it had a guitar solo in it that, you know, if you compared it to Edward Van Halen, for example, some of the guitarists that came along a few years later, it wasn't in that technical realm. But there was something about this guitar solo, and at the end of the solo, there was a series of short staccato bends. And I can't articulate how that made me feel as a kid. Just moved me. I would drop the needle on that song 100 times a day when my brother wasn't around. Can you imagine Donald Where's Your Trousers at some point in the morning, followed up with Golden Earring or Grand Funk or something in the afternoon? Constant in the house.
The love for music, that's been through everything, but where did the love for television come from?
That's a really good question, Scott, and I've never been asked that question, so I thank you and applaud you for that one. That's a really good question. I think, given the age difference between Brother Bruce and myself, I spent a lot of my childhood on my own, which is not to say I didn't have school friends or a good mate, Dunno, lived down the road around the corner, but I spent a lot of time in and around the home on my own. And my immediate go-to friends would be the record player, as we've discussed. My brother had an old acoustic guitar that when my hand was big enough to actually wrap around the neck of this thing, I could pluck out melodies from all of these great albums he had. But my other go-to, easy to get to, mate, was the television. Because it was interesting, wasn't it, for us, and I'm speaking as a guy who's in his 50s, but being born in the mid-60s, Australian television, it might be hard for the youngsters to understand and appreciate in a YouTube world. You know, we had this sort of really interesting mix of largely British and American television. My dear dad loved the British comedies, Dad's Army, Goodies, Dave Allen. And then, of course, you had the American stuff, Scott, the Gilligan's Islands, the Lost in Spaces. If I wasn't bombarding my senses with vinyl, I was bombarding what was left of my senses with television. This all flows to that first grown-up gig, I was going to say, hardly grown up for an 11-year-old, but still. And then communing with an audience and having people dance and applaud and cheer at the end of each song. And, you know, we were doing things. I was playing things back then like Simple Simon Says. Da, 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 da. Do you know what, Scott? If I reach for one of the acoustic guitars here, I could almost probably... It's not so very hard to do. The game is Simple Simon Says. You get to the end of that song, and the joint's been jumping and people are cheering, and I just thought, I love this. I love this way to commune with people. There are people, a lot of people in the audience I knew, of course, and Mum and Dad were very proud, but a lot of people I didn't know, and yet we were connecting. I'm connecting with all these people of different ages, and that was really the thing for me, pursuing performance, whether it was on television or on stage or toying with a pop career for a bit. It was always about the people. It was all about communing with the audience. You'd be hard-pressed to find many historic shots of me attending events or red carpet events or any of that sort of thing. It was never about celebrity for me. I couldn't care less about that. But what I cared about and what I always cared about was that feeling, Scott, of communing with an audience. And it's a little bit different to standing on stage and letting fly with an emotive, wild guitar solo. But still, that communion happens at some point.
I'm going to pick you up on that, and I'm going to jump forward quite a considerable bit here, but I think it's right to do it. I'm going to bring in Dr. Lucine Blake. I'm going to talk Grant Mitchell, and I'm going to talk Henry Ramsey. Who's your favourite and who do you like least?
That's another great question, Scott, and I've never been asked that before. Do you know, there's always going to be enormous affection for Henry, just because that was my first big contracted role for that character, and just that period of the show, to be honest, that mid to late 80s period of the show, tremendous affection for that time. Least favourite, I don't know if there's a least favourite just in those examples, but, you know, I can quietly tell you that there have been a few films I've done over the years that thankfully haven't seen the light of day. And no amount of money will get me to tell you what those films were, Scotty, but I can tell you they were crook. Definitely, in terms of a favourite and a pinnacle for all sorts of reasons, was the 6 years I spent playing Dr. Lucien Blake. 6 years is a long time, but it never felt like a long time. It was just such a joy.
Did musical theatre bring it all together? Did it bring your television aspirations and your love for music and put it in one place that got you in front of a crowd and had it all?
Scott, I have to congratulate you again. I've never been asked that question either, and it's a good one. In all honesty, other than playing guitar in music theatre shows when I was in high school, I never, hand on heart, I never ever thought of, you know, when you dream about the kind of career you might have. Music theatre didn't actually figure into what I was thinking. I was thinking, increasingly, I was seeing how popular actors or performers on television, it enabled them to branch off into other areas. And I thought, whatever comes first, if I was able to secure a recording contract, great. If I was able to secure a television contract on a popular show and I was blessed enough to deliver a character that proved popular with the people, that might enable me to take a step into music, as I've been playing all my life, really. But music theatre didn't really enter my plans And in 1992, or late 91, a certain Australian concert promoter secured permission to do what he called a new version of the Rocky Horror Show. In fact, it was billed, I think, as the new Rocky Horror Show. It meant totally different set design. It meant updated costume design. And it was all designed by the late Nigel Triffett, who was quite a clever cat. And they phoned me up and said, we'd like to talk to you about playing Rocky, the blonde, muscled-up creation, the Frankensteinian sort of creation in the show. And I said, listen, if you're ringing me up to do Rocky Horror, there's only one role, and that's the mad scientist, Dr. Frankenfurter. Well, they were silent on the phone, and then they piped up and said, we didn't think you'd be interested in that. Wholesome Neighbours, lovable Larrick and Henry from Neighbours. I was only young at that point, in my early 20s. And I said, no, it's just what the doctor ordered, Scott.
Yeah.
It was so very different. And I only agreed to do it basically because I knew who the musicians were going to be in the band. I knew it was going to rock. And I thought, well, that'll be my one and only music theatre show. There's an element of Alice Cooper in it. There's an element of Kiss. There's an element of all that glam rock stuff. You Beauty. Before I knew it, I'm on the West End stage doing another musical, and I'm thinking, how did that happen?
Across all of those things, and we haven't spoken about Check 1 2, and we haven't spoken about Mona, and, who is the person behind Amanda either, but there's so much in that space that you've done.
Scotty, you've done your homework. Who's the person behind Amanda?
Can you give us a clue?
Yes, I could give you a clue. I can tell you that predicting I'd be asked this question perhaps years down the track, when I wrote the song about a particular person, I didn't use that particular person's name.
Oh.
So that someone couldn't say, you wrote that about Joanna, or you wrote that about Debbie, a girlfriend you were seeing at the time, or your first girlfriend at high school. Folks, all I can tell you is I did write it about a girl, but her name wasn't Amanda.
Good answer. Going to move on, and we're going to talk about the future. We're going to talk about, out of all of those things, what's the one thing that's on your bucket list that you want to do next?
Oh. Wow. Well, just very briefly addressing something that I know we're not here to talk about today, but it's been a particularly tough 6.5 years for me and my family.
Uh-huh.
And really, as I look to the future, it's all about doing things differently. Clearly, I have, quite understandably, trust issues. If someone who's texting you saying they love you and we can't wait to catch up and have dinner, and texting your partner years after it turns out she's alleging I was a bully or whatever, that person who has duplicitously presented themselves as a good friend for years, not weeks, not months, who you're currently working with in the year 2017 and is exchanging loving messages between she, me and my partner, then goes to the press to destroy my reputation and life. And in doing so, bringing unimaginable pain to my son, to my partner, to my mum, to know my mum has a heart attack as I'm walking into court. It's unforgivable stuff. And I have to turn to the good Lord to work out how I can reconcile such evil duplicity. So moving forward, Scotty, and thinking about how to best do that, you got to find the love again. You got to remind yourself why you started performing in the first place. And all jokes aside, it wasn't about accumulating a swag full of Logies. It wasn't about the silver, gold and platinum records I've got on my wall. It wasn't about the Helpman Awards. It wasn't about the ARIA Awards. It was about communing with the people. and loving that. And so with your another very good question about a bucket list thing, really, I just want to get back to that place of sharing these creative experiences with the people. And the first step to doing that, and what a perfect segue to talk about Andy Penko, was Andy asking me to play guitar for him at an intimate little gig in Sydney not long ago. And as you can imagine, Scott, it was a little bit of, if I can quote Mel Brooks, there was a little bit of high anxiety for me, and not just performing in front of people again in such a honest, stripped back, naked way. Not that Andy and I were naked before anyone jumps up, fingers on fretboards and a microphone, that's it. But also when you've had 30-something years of dizzying experiences, that not that I ever took things for granted. And forgive me if this sounds crazy. God knows I've been called a lot worse. But you kind of get used to things like singing for the Queen. You get used to going and recording and mixing a track with Barry Gibb. You get used to stepping out and selling 15 sold-out Melbourne tennis centres starring as Danny Zuko in an arena version of Grease. What I'm saying is, apart from the obvious anxiety of that little gig, there was also just getting my head around that, well, this is different. I'm not hiding behind a $10 million production here. This is not a hydraulic stage in the middle of, the round of the tennis centre. This is really stripping it back to bare bones. This is as honest as it gets. Is that something I'm even able to do anymore? I don't know. Well, it turned out to be not taking anything away from performing for the much-loved late Queen Elizabeth. And there are funny stories surrounding that. We'll save that for another interview, Scott. Very funny stories. Things that can only happen to a kid from the central coast of New South Wales whose middle name's Dougal. But anyway, that little gig with Andy would rate one of the most fulfilling and enjoyable and moving experiences I've ever had as a performer. And it's not just about the fact that, we played and performed really well on the night. It was really just about the communion with the people who were gathered there that night. It was so very special. I joined him on a set, just adding some colour and texture to some of his wonderful songs. And it felt like we'd played together since we were 10-year-old kids. That's the truth, because I'm stepping out on tour with the guy. It was a really, really special night for Andy and I and for those wonderful folk who came along. So the bucket list is just to get back to doing what drove me, even as that 11-year-old standing on that stage, wide-eyed, because people were clapping and cheering when I played the final riff to Simple Simon Says, to get back to that place.
Oh, that's fantastic, Craig. Look, thanks so much for taking the time and taking us through so much there. Like, as you mentioned, it'd be great to chat again very, very soon and find out exactly what you and the Queen did get up to. But we will save that for another day. It's been an absolute pleasure. You take care.
Thank you so much, Scotty. I so appreciate you getting in touch, and this has been a real treat for me today, and thanks to your listeners.